The night everything changed. The clock ticked past midnight, its rhythmic sound filling the small apartment like an invisible metronome of fate. 9-year-old Emily Carter lay curled up in bed, clutching her stuffed bunny to her chest. Outside, the city murmured in its restless slumber, sirens wailing in the distance, the occasional honk of a car, muffled voices from the alley below. Her mother, Sophie Carter, was still awake, working late in the small home office next to Emily's room. The soft clatter of a keyboard drifted through the thin walls. Emily always found comfort in that sound. It meant her mother was near. It meant things were normal. But normal was an illusion, and that illusion shattered with 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Gang, bang, bang. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her heart pounding. At first, she thought she had dreamt it. But then, she heard the voices, low, urgent, and unfamiliar. Open up. Police. Fear gripped her tiny frame. She sat up, hugging her bunny tighter. The hallway light flickered under her bedroom door as footsteps shuffled toward the front entrance. Sophie's voice came next, laced with confusion. What's going on? Emily crept out of bed, tiptoeing toward the door. She peered through the crack, watching as her mother unlatched the chain. The second the door swung open, the world shifted. 3 uniformed officers surged inside. Their expressions were hard, their movements mechanical, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Sophie Carter, one of them barked. You are under arrest for the murder of Daniel Thompson. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. Emily's breath hitched. Murder. Her mother gasped, stumbling backward. No, there's been a mistake. I don't even know anyone named Daniel Thompson. The officers didn't hesitate. They seized her wrists, yanking her arms behind her back. The cold bite of handcuffs clicked into place. Emily's tiny fists clenched. No, this couldn't be real. She bolted from her hiding spot, racing toward the officers, her heart screaming inside her chest. Mommy. Sophie twisted, desperation flashing in her tear-filled eyes. Emily. Stay back. Emily didn't listen. She ran, reaching out, but one of the officers, his face soft with pity, blocked her. Don't take her. Emily sobbed, trying to push past him. Her mother turned, her voice firm despite the panic. Listen to me, baby. I will fix this. I promise. Emily felt her mother's fingers squeeze hers for a fleeting second before the officers dragged her away. Then the front door slammed. Then the world fell silent. The whispers began. The days that followed felt like a blur. Emily had been placed in the care of Mrs. Roberts, their elderly neighbor with soft wrinkles and kind but tired eyes. The woman tried to comfort her, making her warm meals, offering hugs, and even letting her watch TV late at night. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't home. School wasn't safe either. The whispers started almost immediately. Did you hear? Her mom killed someone. No way. She doesn't look like a killer's kid. Maybe she helped. Maybe she's dangerous too. Emily kept her head down, gripping her backpack straps as she walked through the hallways. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were wrong. But she didn't, because none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered: finding out the truth. She knew her mother was innocent, and if no one else was going to prove it, then she would. A name that changed everything. Mrs. Roberts thought Emily was asleep when she turned on the news that night. She wasn't. Lying on the couch, curled under a thin blanket, Emily listened as the newscaster droned on about the case. In a shocking turn of events, businessman Brian Reynolds has come forward as an eyewitness, placing Sophie Carter at the scene of the crime. Emily's brows furrowed. Brian Reynolds. The name tickled at the edge of her memory. It felt familiar. Then she remembered. She had seen that name before. Heart pounding, Emily sat up slowly. Mrs. Roberts had dozed off in her chair, snoring softly. This was her chance. Slipping off the couch, she tiptoed toward the hallway. The door to her apartment, her real home, was locked, But Mrs. Roberts kept the spare key on the kitchen counter. She grabbed it. She didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to be afraid. She ran. Secrets in the shadows. Emily's fingers trembled as she unlocked the door to her home. The apartment was cold, untouched since the night her mother was taken. Dust hung in the air. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where she was going. Her mother's office. For as long as Emily could remember, Sophie had always kept her work files neatly stacked. She had told Emily never to touch them. But rules didn't matter anymore. Climbing onto the desk chair, Emily began flipping through the folders. Papers slid through her fingers. Legal contracts, receipts, court documents. And then, her breath caught. A photo. It was attached to an old client file, one her mother had been working on just weeks before her arrest. A familiar face stared back at her. Brian Reynolds. Emily's stomach twisted. He had lied. He had told the police he didn't know her mother. But here he was, clear as day, in her mother's files. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. Something was very, very wrong. Then, just as she was about to close the folder, she heard it. A soft creak outside the window. She froze. For a split second, she thought it was her imagination. But then, footsteps. Someone was outside. She whipped around, her small hands clutching the folder tight. A dark shadow loomed near the window, just beyond the curtains. Emily's breath hitched. She wasn't alone. The silent escape. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't move. The shadow shifted. Then, a hand pressed against the glass. Emily forced herself to move. She slid off the chair as quietly as she could, clutching the folder to her chest. Her tiny feet padded toward the front door, every breath a struggle to keep silent. Another creak. The doorknob twisted. Panic surged through her. With a burst of adrenaline, she yanked the door open and bolted. Her bare feet hit the pavement as she sprinted across the apartment complex. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. She just ran. She didn't know who that man was. She didn't know if he had seen her face. But she knew one thing. She had found something she wasn't supposed to. And now, someone wanted her silenced. A truth no one once heard. The wind howled as Emily Carter ran through the darkened streets, her breath ragged, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The file, her mother's file, was clutched so tightly in her small hands that the edges crumpled. She didn't stop, didn't dare slow down, not even when her bare feet stung against the cold pavement. Behind her, the shadow near her apartment hadn't moved. Yet. But she knew whoever it was, they had been watching. She couldn't go back to Mrs. Roberts. If she was being followed, she couldn't risk leading the danger to the one person who had taken her in. She needed to go somewhere safe. Somewhere they wouldn't expect. Then, like a flicker of light in the darkness, an idea hit her. She turned sharply into an alleyway, dodging piles of trash and broken crates, and ducked through the back entrance of the only place she knew was still open this late. The police station. A child walks into the lion's den. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead, harsh and sterile, casting shadows that flickered unnervingly along the tiled floor. Officers milled about, typing reports, taking calls, drinking coffee. No one noticed the small girl standing at the entrance, her hair messy from the wind, her feet dirty, her hands gripping a folder like it contained the entire truth of the universe. Emily swallowed her fear and walked toward the front desk. A female officer with dark hair and sharp, tired eyes barely glanced up from her paperwork. "This isn't a shelter, kid. Where are your parents?" Emily inhaled deeply. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "My name is Emily Carter. My mom was arrested." The officer stiffened slightly, her eyes flicking to the child's face with more interest now. "Carter." Emily nodded and placed the file on the desk. "My mom didn't do it," she whispered. "And I can prove it." For a long moment, the officer didn't speak. Then, with a sigh, she reached for the file. And then, a voice cut through the air like a blade. What do we have here? Emily turned, and a cold chill ran down her spine. Detective Alan Pierce, the man who smiled like a wolf. Detective Pierce was a tall man with short graying hair and a neatly pressed suit. His smile was tight, calculated, like he was always in on a joke that no one else could understand. Emily did not like him. She remembered seeing him the night they took her mother away. He had been there, standing in the corner, arms crossed, watching everything unfold without a trace of emotion. Now that same unreadable expression was on his face as he walked toward her. "What are you doing here, Emily?" he asked smoothly. Emily took a step back, suddenly unsure. Something about him made her skin crawl. She hesitated. "I brought evidence." Detective Pierce's eyes flicked to the folder in the officer's hands. Something unreadable passed across his face. Too fast for Emily to catch, but she felt it. The female officer cleared her throat. "She says it proves Sophie Carter is innocent." Pierce chuckled, shaking his head. "That's sweet, but I'm afraid that's not how things work, kid." Emily frowned. "But it's the truth." Pierce's gaze hardened, but his smile never wavered. "And sometimes the truth isn't enough." With that, he reached for the folder. Emily moved faster. She snatched it off the desk before his fingers could touch it. "No," she said, gripping it tightly. "Not until I talk to someone else." For the first time, Pierce's polite mask cracked, just slightly. His fingers twitched. His jaw tightened. The female officer shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should." But before she could finish, another voice cut in. "What's going on here?" Emily turned, and relief flooded her. Detective Mason Carter, a friend in the dark. Mason Carter was younger than Pierce, but he carried the same air of authority. His short brown hair was slightly disheveled, and his 5 o'clock shadow made him look perpetually exhausted. But his eyes weren't like Pierce's. They were sharp, yes, but they weren't cold. Emily didn't know why, but she trusted him. Pierce, however, did not seem happy to see him. "Detective Carter," he said, voice smooth but clipped. "Didn't expect you here tonight." Mason crossed his arms, his gaze flicking between Emily and the folder. "And I didn't expect to see a 9-year-old bringing in her own case file." Emily swallowed hard. "I need to talk to someone who will actually listen." Mason studied her for a moment. Then he sighed. "All right, kid. Let's talk." Pierce's smile thinned. "I don't think that's necessary." "It is," Mason interrupted coolly. "And it's happening now." Pierce's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Mason gestured for Emily to follow him into his office. Emily didn't hesitate. The missing pieces. Mason's office was messy. Papers everywhere, coffee cups stacked precariously, a jacket thrown over his chair. Emily sat stiffly as Mason leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "All right, Emily. Tell me everything." She told him everything. About the whispers at school. About the news report. About finding Brian Reynolds' name in her mother's files. About the shadow outside her apartment. Mason's face darkened at that last part. "And you're sure someone was watching you?" Emily nodded. Mason exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "Jesus." Then, without a word, he grabbed his phone and started dialing. Emily frowned. "Who are you calling?" Mason held up a finger, listening. "Yeah, it's me. I need a trace on Brian Reynolds' financials." Now, a pause. Then his jaw tightened. "What do you mean they're sealed?" He muttered a curse under his breath and hung up. Emily tilted her head. "What's wrong?" Mason hesitated. Then he sighed. "Emily, you just opened a door that someone wanted shut. Nowhere is safe." An hour later, Mason drove Emily back to Mrs. Roberts' house. The streets were eerily quiet. Emily watched the passing buildings, her hands clenched into fists. "Mason," she whispered. He glanced at her. "Do you think Brian Reynolds is lying?" Mason exhaled slowly. "I think Brian Reynolds is hiding something. And I think whoever framed your mom is willing to do whatever it takes to keep it that way." Emily swallowed hard. As they pulled up to Mrs. Roberts' house, a sudden chill crawled up Emily's spine. Something wasn't right. The front door was ajar. And inside, the lights were off. Mason immediately reached for his gun. "Stay in the car," he ordered. Emily's heart pounded as he stepped out, moving cautiously toward the house. Then, bang, a single gunshot. Mason froze. Emily clapped a hand over her mouth, terror flooding her veins. Then, from inside the house, a voice drifted through the darkness. "Emily, come inside." And Emily knew. They had been waiting for her. The trap has been set. The voice calling Emily from inside the darkened house sent ice-cold fear crawling up her spine. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Mason stood frozen outside the car, gun drawn, his body rigid with tension. The front door to Mrs. Roberts' house was ajar, the dim glow of a single flickering hallway light barely illuminating the interior. Whoever was inside was waiting for her. Mason's jaw clenched. "Emily, stay in the car. Lock the doors. Do not move." Emily gripped the seat, but her mind screamed at her. Mrs. Roberts. She was inside. What if she was hurt? What if? Before Emily could make a decision, Mason moved. He stepped forward cautiously, his gun raised as he approached the house. His eyes flicked to the windows, scanning for movement. Emily held her breath. Then, a creak. From deep inside the house. Mason's voice was low, steady. "This is the police. Come out now. Hands where I can see them." Silence. Then a chuckle. Soft. Mocking. Emily's stomach clenched. Mason's entire body tensed. Then, the lights inside the house cut out. A cold, suffocating darkness swallowed the entire home. Emily gasped. Mason cursed under his breath, reaching for the flashlight on his belt. Then a second gunshot ripped through the air. The hunter and the prey. Emily ducked instinctively, her hands flying to her ears. The sound echoed in her skull, making her entire body tremble. Mason lunged for cover behind the porch railing, his gun sweeping toward the house. "Stay down," he yelled. Emily couldn't see anything. The darkness inside the house was absolute. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, as if something unnatural lurked beyond them. Then, a third gunshot. This time, the bullet struck the porch railing just inches from Mason's head. Splinters flew. Mason returned fire, twice. Emily's breath caught as a figure moved in the darkness. A tall silhouette, shadowed against the dim light from the street lamp. Watching. Waiting. Mason's voice was ice. "Drop the weapon. Now." The figure took a step forward. Then, a laugh. Low, amused. "You shouldn't have brought the girl into this." Emily's blood ran cold. Mason didn't hesitate. He fired again. But the figure was already moving. A blur of motion. Silent. Controlled. Then the back door of the house slammed. Gone. Mason exhaled sharply, lowering his gun slightly. But his shoulders remained rigid, his entire body still on high alert. "Emily," he said firmly, turning back toward the car. "We need tow." Then a scream. "Mrs. Roberts." Emily's eyes widened. "Mrs. Roberts." Without thinking, she bolted. "Emily, stop." Mason shouted, but it was too late. She ran into the house. Darkness holds no mercy. The air inside the house was thick with tension. It smelled wrong. Like sweat. Like fear. Like someone else had been inside for too long. Emily's bare feet barely made a sound against the wooden floor as she stumbled forward, her breath shaky. The living room was in shambles. The couch had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor, a lamp knocked over. Then she saw her. Mrs. Roberts. The old woman sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her wrists tied with thick black zip ties. Her mouth was gagged, her eyes wide and full of terror. Emily gasped and rushed forward, fumbling with the gag. "Mrs. Roberts, are you okay? What happened?" The moment she yanked the gag down, Mrs. Roberts gasped for air. Then she grabbed Emily's wrist with a vice grip. "Emily, run." Emily froze. "What?" "It's a trap." A shadow loomed behind her. A rough hand clamped over her mouth. A strong arm locked around her waist. Emily screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was iron-tight. Mrs. Roberts cried out, struggling against her restraints, but she was too weak. Emily's heart pounded violently in her chest. "No, no, no." Then Mason's voice thundered through the house. "Drop here." Emily barely caught a glimpse of him standing in the doorway, his gun raised, his entire stance screaming danger. But the man holding Emily didn't hesitate. He moved fast. A gunshot. A flash of pain in her shoulder. Emily screamed. Then, blackness. A race against time. When Emily woke up, she wasn't in Mrs. Roberts' house anymore. She wasn't anywhere she recognized. Her head throbbed. Her arm ached. She was lying on a cold metal floor, her hands tied in front of her. The room smelled of gasoline and rust. It was small, with a single flickering bulb overhead. Emily's heart pounded. Where was she? Then a door creaked open. Footsteps. A shadow stepped inside. And Emily finally saw his face. Tall. Suit pressed to perfection. A cruel, practiced smirk on his lips. Brian Reynolds. Emily's stomach dropped. He crouched in front of her, his cold, calculating eyes sweeping over her like she was nothing. "Hello, Emily," he said softly. Emily's breath hitched. He smiled wider. "You've been causing me a lot of problems, little girl." She tried to move, to scramble away, but she had nowhere to go. Brian sighed dramatically, straightening his tie. "See, I thought your mother was going to be the problem. But it turns out." His eyes darkened. "It was you all along." Emily clenched her fists, her entire body trembling. Then Brian leaned in closer, his voice a whisper. "Tell me, Emily, how much is your life worth to your mother?" The walls seemed to close in. Her vision blurred. The nightmare had only just begun. The cost of the truth. The cold metal of the floor seeped into Emily's skin, numbing her to the bone. Her wrists ached from the zip ties, her head throbbed from where she had been struck, and her shoulder burned. The gunshot. She hadn't even realized she'd been shot until now. It wasn't deep, wasn't life-threatening, but the pain was sharp and unrelenting. Brian Reynolds sat in front of her, a smug, controlled smile on his lips. He wasn't in a hurry. That terrified her more than anything else. "You're a clever girl, Emily," he mused, adjusting his sleeve cuff. "Too clever." Emily swallowed hard, refusing to cry. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Brian tilted his head. "You know, I almost feel bad. You're just a kid after all. You should be at home, playing with dolls or whatever little girls do these days." His smile turned sharp. "But instead, here you are. And it's your fault." Emily clenched her fists. "My mom didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Brian chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, leaning closer. "That doesn't matter." The words sent a chill through Emily's entire body. Brian sighed, tapping his fingers against his knee. "Your mother got caught up in things she didn't understand. And you made it worse." His eyes darkened. "I had everything handled until you decided to get involved." Emily glared at him, her fear battling against her growing anger. "You framed her," she hissed. Brian's smile widened. "Of course I did." The casual way he admitted it made Emily's stomach turn. "Why?" she demanded. Brian exhaled, shaking his head as if the answer was obvious. "Because someone had to take the fall." Emily's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Brian leaned back against the metal wall, stretching his legs out. Your mom worked in legal consulting. She saw things she wasn't supposed to see. Numbers, transactions, deals. Emily's breath hitched. She didn't even know what she had. Brian continued, his voice almost amused. But it didn't matter. She was too close. And he gestured vaguely to himself, needed someone to blame. Emily felt sick. Brian smiled. But the real mistake wasn't framing her. His gaze sharpened. The real mistake was underestimating you. Emily's stomach twisted. Brian leaned in, his voice dropping lower. You did something that no one else has done. You made them nervous. Emily's fingers twitched. Who? Brian sighed as if she was exhausting him. Oh, Emily. You think I'm the one in charge. He chuckled, shaking his head. I'm just a middleman. A very well-paid, very important middleman. He watched her closely, waiting for the realization to settle in. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger. Emily clenched her jaw, her mind racing. Michael Calloway, she whispered. Brian's smirk flickered. For the first time, Emily saw something behind his cold, controlled mask. Fear. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Emily had caught it. Brian tusked, shaking his head. Now why would you go and say a name like that? Emily didn't answer. Because now she knew she was right. Brian sighed dramatically. This is the problem with smart kids. You don't know when to shut up. He stood, stretching, before looking down at her. It's a shame, really. You've got guts, but that won't help you where you're going. Emily's breath hitched. Where am I going? Brian grinned. Oh, Emily, that depends on your mother. A mother's choice. Sophie Carter's hands shook as she gripped the phone. Where is she? She demanded, her voice raw with panic and rage. Michael Calloway's voice was calm, smooth, cold, safe, for now. Sophie's blood turned to ice. She stood in the dimly lit warehouse Mason had brought her to. A safe house that now felt anything but safe. Mason stood nearby, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Zero, the hacker, sat at a desk, his laptop open, scanning through endless lines of encrypted data. Sophie's grip tightened on the phone. If you hurt her, I swear. Calloway's chuckle made her stomach turn. Relax, Miss Carter. I have no interest in harming a child. I'm not a monster. Sophie's breath shook, then let her go. Calloway hummed, I will. A pause. But first, we need to discuss your options. Sophie swallowed hard. What options? Calloway's voice was slow, measured. You have something I want. A very specific flash drive. You will bring it to me. In exchange, I will return your daughter, unharmed. Sophie's heart pounded. The flash drive. The evidence that could expose Calloway's network. She glanced at Mason. He already knew what was happening. His expression was grim, but he didn't say a word. Calloway's voice darkened. If you refuse, Emily will disappear. Sophie's entire body went cold. You have 1 hour to decide, Calloway continued. I'll send the location shortly. Come alone. No tricks. Click. The line went dead. Sophie's knees nearly buckled. Mason caught her by the arm. Breathe, he said, his voice low, steady. Sophie couldn't breathe. Her daughter, her baby girl, was in the hands of a man who had killed for less. Mason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Damn it. Zero looked up from his laptop, his face pale. This is bad. If Calloway has Emily, we don't have time to play games. Sophie already knew that. She turned to Mason, her voice shaking. We need to go. Now. Mason's jaw tightened. Sophie. She whipped around. I don't care about the evidence. I don't care about Calloway's network. I care about my daughter. Mason's expression didn't change. But Sophie saw the conflict in his eyes. We have 1 hour, she whispered. We don't have time to argue. Mason hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. Zero stood. I'm coming too. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Why? Zero cracked his knuckles. Because I can hack into Calloway's security system before you even walk through the door. Sophie didn't argue. She didn't care how they did it. She just wanted Emily back. The final hour. The location came in minutes later. An abandoned shipping dock on the outskirts of the city. Mason parked the car a block away. Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched the flash drive in her palm. Stick to the plan, Mason reminded her. You go in, keep Calloway talking. Zero, and I will be watching. The second we get an opening, we take them down. Sophie nodded. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't going to end cleanly. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and silent. And inside, waiting for her, was Emily, and the men who were ready to kill to keep their secrets buried. The exchange. Sophie's footsteps echoed against the damp pavement as she approached the towering warehouse at Pier 17. A single rusted floodlight flickered above the entrance, casting long, eerie shadows. Her fingers tightened around the flash drive in her palm, slick with sweat. Inside that warehouse, Emily was waiting. Somewhere in the darkness, Calloway and his men were watching. And Sophie knew one thing for certain. This wasn't an exchange. It was an execution. The thin line between fear and control. A heavy steel door groaned open as Sophie stepped inside. The air smelled of oil, salt water, and something metallic. Blood. A single hanging light bulb swayed from the ceiling, flickering like a dying heartbeat. And then, she saw her. Emily. Her daughter sat on the cold concrete floor, her hands bound in front of her, a dark bruise forming on her cheek. Sophie's breath caught. Emily. Emily's head snapped up. Mom. She tried to stand, but the thick zip ties cut into her wrists, forcing her back down. Sophie's vision blurred with rage. Then, from the shadows, a slow clap. Michael Calloway emerged. He was pristine as ever, his suit crisp, his tie perfectly in place, as if he had just walked out of a boardroom instead of orchestrating a kidnapping. A smug, practiced smile curled on his lips. You're right on time, he said smoothly. Sophie's hands shook at her sides. I brought what you wanted, she said, lifting the flash drive. Now let her go. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. Sophie, he said, almost disappointed. You've worked with powerful people before. You should know by now. Negotiations don't work that way. Her pulse pounded. You said. I know what I said. Calloway tilted his head. But did you really think I'd let you leave? Sophie's breath turned to ice. Emily's eyes widened in horror. No, Emily whispered. Mom, run. Sophie didn't move. She wouldn't leave Emily. Calloway's expression didn't change. Then, with a snap of his fingers, two men stepped out from the darkness. One of them was Brian Reynolds. The other held a gun, pointed directly at Sophie. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. Let's keep this simple, Calloway said, stepping closer. You hand over the flash drive, and I'll consider letting Emily go. Sophie held her ground. Consider, she echoed, her voice steady despite the fear crushing her ribs. Calloway smiled. Well, a child disappearing is much easier to cover up than a mother and a child, wouldn't you say? Emily screamed. No. Sophie's entire body trembled with fury. She turned to Brian Reynolds, who stood behind Calloway, watching silently. You don't have to do this, she spat at him. Brian's expression didn't waver. Yes, I do, he said simply. Sophie's blood boiled. Calloway sighed dramatically, as if bored. Enough of this, he said, turning to his gunman. Kill her. The gunshot that changed everything. Time slowed. The gunman lifted his weapon. Emily screamed. Sophie braced herself. Bang! A gunshot tore through the air. But it wasn't aimed at Sophie. The gunman stumbled backward, clutching his chest, eyes wide with shock. Then, he collapsed. Sophie's mind reeled. What? Then she saw him. Mason. He was crouched on the upper level of the warehouse, gun still smoking from the shot he just fired. You didn't actually think she came alone, did you? Mason's voice dripped with amusement. Chaos erupted. Calloway snarled. Kill them all. More men poured into the warehouse. Gunfire exploded. Sophie dove for cover, barely dodging the next bullet. Emily screamed as Calloway yanked her up by the arm, his grip tight like a vice. Let her go, Sophie roared, lunging forward. But Brian Reynolds grabbed her, forcing her back. Calloway's eyes burned with fury. You just couldn't walk away, he growled, dragging Emily toward the back exit. Sophie fought against Brian, kicking, clawing, her mother's instincts turning vicious. Then, GTOFF her. Emily bit Calloway's hand. Hard. Calloway yelled, dropping her. Emily bolted, straight into her mother's arms. Sophie clutched her tight, breathing ragged, desperate, relieved. But Brian wasn't done. He recovered too fast, grabbing Emily's hair, yanking her away from Sophie's grasp. Emily screamed in pain. Brian pressed a knife to her throat. Don't move, he warned, his voice deadly. Sophie froze. Mason, from above, aimed his gun, but hesitated. One wrong move, and Emily was dead. Calloway smirked, straightening his suit, regaining control. You see, Sophie, he said casually, this is why you should have taken my offer the first time. Sophie's teeth clenched. Her eyes flicked to the flash drive in her palm. Then, she made a choice. The final gamble. Sophie threw the flash drive. Hard. It soared through the air and plunged into the open flames of a burning metal barrel. Calloway's smile vanished. The drive melted instantly. Gone. Forever. Brian's grip faltered. And that was all Sophie needed. She lunged forward, ripping Emily from his grasp. Mason fired. The bullet struck Brian in the chest. He staggered, choked, then collapsed. Calloway stood paralyzed, staring at the flames where the flash drive once was. His entire empire, burning away. He turned to Sophie, his face twisted with rage. You have no idea what you've done. Sophie held Emily tight, her breathing heavy, but victorious. Yes, I do, she said coldly. Outside, sirens screamed. The police were here. Calloway's men scattered like rats. Mason grabbed Sophie's arm. Time to go. Sophie ran. She didn't look back. Didn't stop. Didn't care that Calloway's empire was crumbling behind her. Because she had what mattered most. She had Emily. And for the first time, they were finally free. The end of a king. The city was on fire with news of what had happened at Pier 17. Headlines screamed of corruption. Police chiefs expose. A deadly shootout at an abandoned warehouse. But Sophie Carter didn't care about any of that. All she cared about was Emily. They sat in the back of a police cruiser, the cold leather seats pressing against Sophie's back as she clutched her daughter tight. Emily was shaking. She hadn't spoken since they fled the warehouse, since Calloway's empire had collapsed in flames, since Mason had shot Brian Reynolds and the entire world had turned upside down. The police weren't there to arrest them. They were there to clean up Calloway's mess, to silence the witnesses. Sophie had seen it in their eyes when they arrived. Some of them wanted her dead too. She should have been scared, but all she felt was rage. She had won, and they hated that. Loose ends are meant to be tied. Detective Mason paced outside the police station, his phone pressed to his ear. Where is he? He asked, voice sharp. Zero's voice crackled through the line. Gone. The second the cops showed up, Calloway disappeared. Mason's jaw tightened. Do we have eyes on him? A pause. Then, Zero sighed. We lost him, man. He's off the grid. Mason cursed under his breath. Michael Calloway wasn't the type to go down quietly. He wasn't the type to run. Which meant he was planning something. Mason turned toward the police station. Inside, Sophie and Emily were being processed, not for arrest, but for protective custody. A joke. Mason had been on the force long enough to know what that meant. The department wanted them gone. Evidence like Sophie Carter was bad for business. An offer she can't refuse. The interview room was cold. Sophie sat across from Chief Douglas Hendricks, a man whose name had been all over Callaway's financial transactions. A man who had spent years covering for corrupt officers, bribed judges, and dirty politicians. And now, he was trying to cover for himself. "You've caused quite a mess," Hendricks said, his voice casual, almost bored. Sophie's hands were clenched in her lap. She didn't respond. Hendricks leaned forward. "Callaway is gone," he said. "Brian Reynolds is dead. That should be the end of this." Sophie's jaw clenched. "Then why am I here?" Hendricks smiled. "Because you don't understand how things work." Sophie inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay calm. "Enlighten me." Hendricks exhaled, as if she was a child who had failed to follow instructions. "You're a problem, Miss Carter." Sophie's pulse pounded. "You have evidence. Even without that flash drive, you know names. You know dates." His voice lowered. "You know too much." Sophie's stomach twisted. Emily. They wouldn't just come after her. They would come after Emily. Hendricks leaned back in his chair. "But," he continued, "I'm a reasonable man. I believe in solutions, and I'm prepared to offer you one." Sophie stayed silent. Hendricks smiled. "You take your daughter. You disappear. New names, new passports, new life. We wipe everything clean. You walk away. No more trials. No more questions." He folded his hands. "And in exchange, you never say another word about Callaway or his operation. You never go public. You never testify. You let this die." Sophie's heart pounded. She had spent months fighting for the truth. And now, they were asking her to bury it. She glanced at the one-way mirror. She knew Mason was watching. Waiting. Hendricks smiled. "You don't have long to decide." Sophie's mind raced. If she said no, if she refused, they would come for her. They would come for Emily. And she wasn't sure Mason could protect them forever. She took a slow breath. Then, she made a choice. Betrayal and lies. Mason stood outside the interview room, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Zero's voice crackled through his earpiece. "You think she's gonna take the deal?" Mason exhaled. "No, she's smarter than that." A pause. "Yeah," Zero said finally. "That's what I'm afraid of." Mason frowned. "What do you mean?" Zero hesitated. "Listen, man. I've been tracking Callaway's accounts. Some of them are still active." Mason's blood went cold. "That's impossible. We burned his entire network." "Not all of it," Zero muttered. "There are ghost accounts. And they're still moving money." Mason's breath caught. Callaway wasn't gone. He was funding something. Mason's heart pounded. "Do you have a location?" Zero's voice dropped lower. "Yeah," he said, "but you're not gonna like it." The final battle. The safe house was dark. The moment Mason stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The air felt too still. The windows were boarded up, but light flickered inside. He gripped his gun, moving slowly. Zero had traced Callaway's last transaction to this location. If Callaway was here, it ended tonight. Mason stepped into the main room. A single chair sat in the center. Facing away from him, a figure was tied to it. A woman. Mason's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, gun raised. Callaway. No response. Then, a low, shaky breath. Mason's blood ran cold. Because it wasn't Callaway. It was Sophie. Her arms were bound, her face bruised, her breathing shallow. Mason rushed forward, untying her. "Sophie, what the hell happened?" She looked up, eyes glassy with pain. "He was here," she whispered. Mason froze. Who? Sophie swallowed hard. Calloway, she whispered. Mason's grip tightened. Where is he? Then, the door behind them slammed shut, and a voice chuckled. Right here. Mason spun. Michael Calloway stepped out of the shadows, his signature smirk in place. But this time, there was no amusement in his eyes, only pure, focused hate. Mason raised his gun, but Calloway didn't flinch. Instead, he held up a burner phone. One single number on the screen. Emily. Mason's breath caught. Calloway tilted his head. You shoot me, he whispered. The phone rings. Mason's finger hovered over the trigger. Sophie shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. Calloway smiled. Go on, he said softly. Let's see who answers. Mason's entire body went still, because suddenly, it wasn't just about Calloway anymore. It was about Emily. And Mason had no idea if she was still alive. The end of the road. The burner phone in Michael Calloway's hand glowed like a ticking time bomb. One single number on the screen. Emily. Mason didn't breathe. Neither did Sophie. Her wrists were raw from the rope burns, her face swollen, but she didn't care. All she could see was that phone. That one number. A cold smirk curled on Calloway's lips. Go ahead, he whispered, holding up the phone. Pull the trigger. Let's see if she picks up. Mason's grip tightened around his gun. You're bluffing, he said. Calloway tilted his head. Am I? The phone buzzed. Mason's heart pounded. The screen flashed once. Twice. Then, a soft, hesitant click, and a voice. Small, frightened. Hello. Sophie gasped. Emily. Mason felt the world tilt beneath him. His vision blurred. Calloway's smile widened. She sounds scared, he murmured, his voice mocking. I would be too. Poor thing has no idea what's about to happen. Sophie lunged forward. Where are you eyes, she? Calloway sidestepped smoothly, keeping the phone just out of reach. Tisk, tisk, he chided. That's not how negotiations work, Miss Carter. Sophie's chest burned with rage. You sick? Calloway's expression darkened. Careful, he whispered. I don't have to keep her alive. Sophie froze. Mason's finger twitched on the trigger. Calloway let the words linger, watching their expressions with amusement. Then, he dropped the phone. It clattered against the concrete floor. Sophie's heart stopped. She dove for it, snatching it up with shaking hands. Emily. Silence. Then, a small broken sob. Mommy. Sophie collapsed against the floor, gripping the phone like a lifeline. I'm here, baby, she choked. I'm right here. A sniffle. I'm scared. Sophie bit back tears. I know, baby. I know. Mason glanced at Calloway, his mind racing. If you hurt her. Calloway chuckled. Relax, detective. She's still breathing. For now. Sophie's hands clenched into fists. Tell me what you want, she whispered. Calloway grinned. Now they were finally speaking his language. A mother's worst nightmare. The location came minutes later. An abandoned hotel on the east side of town, one of Calloway's old safe houses. Mason, Sophie, and Zero piled into the car, speeding through the empty night streets. Sophie's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Mason glanced at her. Sophie. Don't, she snapped. Just drive. Mason sighed. Zero, in the back seat, was furiously typing on his laptop. All right, he muttered. I hacked the hotel's old security system. It's still online, but someone's wiped most of the cameras. Sophie's stomach twisted. Calloway was expecting them. Mason gripped the wheel. How many men? Zero hesitated. I don't know, he admitted, but knowing Calloway, enough. Silence. Sophie swallowed hard. I'm going in first, she said. Mason immediately shook his head. Like hell you are. Sophie turned to him, eyes blazing. That's my daughter in there. And you think Calloway's just going to let you waltz in, grab her, and walk out? Mason snapped. If he wanted her dead, she'd be dead already. Sophie shot back. He's keeping her alive for leverage. Mason clenched his jaw. He hated that she was right. Zero glanced up. I can kill the power, he offered. Cut the lights, maybe give you an opening. Sophie nodded. Mason exhaled sharply. This is suicide, he muttered. Sophie gritted her teeth. Then let's make sure we don't fail. The last stand. The hotel was a corpse of a building. Windows shattered, graffiti covering the walls, the lobby coated in dust and forgotten memories. Somewhere inside, Emily was waiting. Mason led the way, gun drawn. Zero stayed back, watching from his laptop. Sophie moved like a shadow. She knew Calloway would be expecting them. But what he wasn't expecting was a mother with nothing left to lose. A faint whimper echoed from the third floor. Sophie froze. Emily. She moved before Mason could stop her. Her feet pounded up the stairs, heart hammering. She burst into the hallway, gunshots exploding behind her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She slammed through the door at the end of the hall. And there, on the floor, hands tied, was Emily. Sophie's breath caught. Mom. Emily sobbed. Sophie rushed forward, grabbing her daughter. I got you, she whispered, her arms wrapping tight around Emily's small frame. Then, a click. Sophie froze. A gun pressed against her temple. Calloway's voice was smooth as silk. Game over, Miss Carter. Sophie's blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned. Calloway stood behind her, completely calm. Like he had already won. I have to admit, he mused. You put up a hell of a fight. His eyes flicked to Emily. But all things must come to an end. Sophie tightened her grip on Emily. She refused to let this be the end. Not like this. Not after everything. Her fingers itched toward her belt. The knife Mason had given her earlier. One chance. One shot. Calloway's finger tensed on the trigger. Any last words? He murmured. Sophie smiled. Yeah, she whispered. Then she slammed the knife into his side. Calloway gasped, stumbling backward. His grip on the gun faltered. Sophie grabbed Emily and Dove. Gunfire erupted. Then, a single, deafening shot. Sophie turned and saw Mason standing in the doorway. Gun raised. Calloway stared down at his chest, at the bullet hole that wasn't supposed to be there. He wobbled. Then, he collapsed. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips. And then, he was gone. The aftermath. The police found them hours later. Emily, Sophie, and Mason stood outside the burning hotel, watching the flames consume the last of Calloway's empire. Zero leaned against Mason's car, arms crossed. So, he mused, what now? Mason exhaled. Sophie held Emily close. She didn't know. But for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. Emily looked up at her. We go home, Sophie whispered. Emily smiled. Yeah, she said softly. We go home. The final chapter. The flames from the burning hotel crackled in the distance, the orange glow licking at the night sky like hungry tongues. Michael Calloway was dead. His empire was in ruins. But Sophie Carter couldn't relax. Not yet. She stood in the empty lot outside the collapsing building. Emily wrapped tightly in her arms, Mason standing beside her, gun still in his grip. Zero leaned against Mason's car, tapping furiously at his laptop. His screen reflected the end of an era, bank accounts frozen, corrupt officials scrambling, Calloway's network being erased in real time. We need to get out of here, Mason said, his voice tense. Now. Sophie didn't argue. Even with Calloway gone, there were still pieces left behind. People who wouldn't take this lightly. Sophie turned to Zero. Did you get everything? She asked. Zero smirked. Every last dirty little secret. The moment I hit enter, every major news station in the city is getting a full data dump. Judges, cops, politicians, all of them exposed. Mason nodded sharply. Do it. Zero cracked his knuckles and hit send. A second later, his laptop let out a small beep. It was done. Calloway's legacy of corruption had just gone public. For the first time since this nightmare started. Sophie breathed. The last loose end. The next morning, the world was on fire. News anchors stumbled over their words, barely able to process the scale of the scandal. Breaking news. Top officials implicated in a massive criminal conspiracy. Former police chief Douglas Hendricks arrested early this morning. Anonymous sources leak financial transactions linking powerful political figures to organized crime. Michael Calloway, one of the most notorious corporate moguls in the country, found dead. The city was in chaos, and Sophie Carter was nowhere to be found. She sat in a quiet diner on the edge of town, watching it all unfold on a small, dusty television. Emily sat across from her, stirring a cup of hot chocolate, her hands finally steady. Mason slid into the booth beside them, dropping a manila folder onto the table. New passports, new identities, new lives. Sophie glanced down. The names on the IDs weren't theirs, but they would be. Mason leaned forward, his voice low. They're still out there, he murmured. Not everyone in Calloway's network went down. Some of them are gonna want revenge. Sophie met his eyes. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then Mason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You don't have to run, you know, he said. You could stay. Fight back. Help clean up the mess. Sophie's fingers tightened around the passport. Fighting back is what put my daughter in danger, she whispered. I won. That's enough. Mason studied her for a long moment. Then, he nodded. Zero slid into the booth next, grinning. Well, he said, I guess this is goodbye. Sophie gave him a small smile. Try not to get arrested. Zero smirked. No promises. Then he stood and left, disappearing into the morning crowd. Mason exhaled, leaning back. Where will you go? Sophie glanced at Emily. Emily smiled softly. Somewhere new, Sophie said. Somewhere safe. Mason nodded, pushing a set of car keys across the table. A head start. Sophie's throat tightened. Thank you, she murmured. Mason gave her a small, sad smile. You saved her, he said. Sophie shook her head. No, she saved me. Emily reached for her mother's hand, and Sophie held on tight. They stood together, leaving the diner without looking back. No more shadows. No more fear. Just the road ahead, and a future waiting to be written. Epilogue. Shadows fade. Months later, in a city far from where it all began, a woman and her daughter walked through a quiet park. The sun was shining. Laughter filled the air. No one knew their names. No one whispered about murder, crime, or conspiracies. They were free. Emily ran ahead, her laughter ringing like a bell. Sophie watched her, finally at peace. A new beginning, a second chance, and for the first time, in a long time, the past didn't follow them. Because Michael Calloway was dead, and his empire burned to ash.